This week's Tales from the Territories episode covered Stampede Wrestling. I thought this was the weakest of all the episodes so far. It was a Stu Hart love fest. A rare man of honor in a con man's world, is what the narrator said. And honestly, just not a lot of interesting stories in this episode. For the roundtable, they had Bret the Hitman Hart, which was a big get for them, Abdullah the Butcher, Dr. D. David Schultz, and No Class Bobby Bass. Which honestly, that sounds like a PayPal name I would give somebody. That's exactly the kind of name I would give somebody. But No Class Bobby Bass, he got his name, he told the story, by swinging one of the wrestling midgets up into the lights during a battle royal. And Ed Whalen, the announcer, said, that Bobby Bass has got no class. And that's how he got his name. I also love, by the way, how they bleeped the word midget during the episode. The only word they bleeped was midget, but yet they kept the word shit in this episode. So Calgary was the promotion run by Bret's dad up in Calgary, 1948 to 1984, although they revived it a few times after that, but it was never the same. A lot of talents came out of that territory or came through that territory. And not just Bret and Owen, you know, Dynamite Kid, Davey Boy Smith, Jim Neidhart, Brian Pillman, Chris Benoit, Bad News Allen, Abdullah, David Schultz. Even Andre the Giant worked for Stu Hart at various points until one incident that Bret talked about, and this was honestly one of the few interesting stories I thought in the entire episode. It was Bret and his brother Smith. It was their job to pick up Andre and take him to the airport so that he can make his flight home. Bret let Smith drive because they were running late. Andre was so annoyed, he didn't think he was going to make it in time. Smith drove like a lunatic to try to get him to the airport. 120 miles an hour, Bret said, to get this guy to the airport. And the entire time, Andre is in the back seat of this car trying to hold on for dear life. He's got his hand pushing up on the roof. The police are following them. The sirens are going. Smith won't stop because if he stops, Andre's going to miss his flight. So he floors it up a ramp at one point. He nearly flipped the car. They finally pull into the airport. They race inside. They left Bret in the car. Now here come the cops. Guns drawn. They tell Bret to get out of the car. Bret is telling this sob story. He's lying to them and says, well, you know, my brother is running a show in Montana and we're going to go out of business. The family would if they didn't make the show. And we had to get Andre on that plane. So suddenly here comes Andre and Smith. They missed the flight. Andre missed it. And Bret says that Andre never worked for Stu again. After that, he never even spoke to Stu. Stu can never understand why Andre just cut him off like that. And Bret would tell him, look, you had to be in the car that day to understand why he was so pissed. So Andre, it's not the first time there's been a story told that Andre could hold a grudge. If he didn't like you, then he wanted nothing to do with you. And if you worked in the same company and he didn't like you, he'd probably make your life a living hell. And it took Bret some time before Andre eventually warmed up to him because they did work together in WWE. But they became very friendly later on. They were all very deferential in the episode to Stu Hart. Bret, of course, I mean, you would expect him to be. It's his father. Nobody told any stories about eating breakfast at the Hart House and watching Stu scoop up cat shit with the spatula that he was using to make eggs. That's always been a very popular story. Dynamite Kid told that story first in his book. And Bret said that he never spoke to him again after that. Think of all the awful shit that Dynamite admitted and copped to in his book. Why would he make that up? He wasn't the only one to mention that. Terry Funk had a similar story about Stu in his book, which makes me wonder how many people ate cat shit eggs at the Hart House over all those years. You see, there's an interesting buy or sell question. Would you rather eat Stu Hart cat shit eggs or get stretched by Stu in the dungeon? Stu never smartened up his kids to the business. So Bret told the story of when it finally dawned on him what wrestling really was. There was a big star in the territory named Archie the Stomper Goldie. And he saw the Stomper on TV once say that he was going to come to Stu, because he was feuding with Stu. And he saw the Stomper say, I'm going to come to Stu's house and I'm going to pile drive his wife, Helen, on the interstate. Which, by the way, could have multiple meanings. You tell somebody you're going to come to your house and pile drive your wife, they might take that the wrong way. But he said he was going to pile drive Stu's wife on the interstate. And they actually included the clip in the episode of him saying this. So naturally, the thought of this scary man coming to his home and pile driving his mother scared the crap out of Bret. So then one day, Archie comes to the house. He could see him out the window. He's walking up to the door, and he's getting scared, like, uh-oh. And Helen cracks the door open a little bit, hands him his paycheck for that week. And she was being very nice to this man, who on television had broken his father's arm. He couldn't understand why his mother was being so nice to this guy. But what tipped him off was about wrestling being what it is and being a work was Stu had a cast on to sell the injury. And anytime somebody rang the doorbell and came to the house, the mailman or whoever it would be, Stu would race to go put the cast on his arm because it wasn't like he was walking around his own home in a cast that, for a fake injury. So he would scramble to go put the cast on, and that's when Bret started to pick up on what was really going on. We had Dr. D talking about how you would never want to leave your coffee cup unattended back then because if you did, it was pretty much a guarantee that somebody was going to spike your drink with something. He made the mistake of leaving his cup one day. He ended up on an acid trip. His revenge, and I'm going to file this away. This is good to know. His revenge was his wife one day was at home baking cookies. And he asked her, make about 25 or 30 more of those. And he took those 30 cookies and he added X-Lax to them. And he brought them to the next show to share with the boys. But he placed a few regular non-X-Lax cookies on top so that when he brought them in, he could reach in and he could eat some. So they wouldn't think, oh, it's weird that you're not having any. He also put horse laxative in them. So imagine what those toilets must have looked like in that locker room. Bret said Calgary was famous for what they called Mabel parties. And we're not talking about Men on a Mission Mabel. We're talking a hot redhead named Mabel who would throw parties for wrestlers and would flirt with them. And the story was that her husband was out of town. They would tell the wrestler, the Mark in this case, that her husband was out of town. And the wrestlers would want to come to the parties and have some fun with her. Then the husband would come home. He would break in with a shotgun when she was with one of the unsuspecting wrestlers and would start firing blanks. And the boys who were in on the joke would pretend to be shot and they would smear ketchup on themselves and rub it all over their shirt. And the Mark, whoever it was, would go running for their life out the back door or whatever. And later on, they would show up with the police thinking that, people have been shot, right? Bring the police back to the house. It got to a point where the cops knew all about the rib. So when they would come to the house, they would go in and they would drink beers with them and they would have a good laugh about it. They talked about the death of the territory, and David Schultz blamed it on Bad News Allen. He said that he and Bad News worked some tours together in Japan. They got along fine. When they came back to Calgary, he claims that Bad News wanted his spot as the top heel. And look, Bad News is not around anymore to give us his side of the story, but that's Schultz's side of it. But Bad News was always getting suspended by the commission there for using a fork in his matches, which is funny to me. The irony was not lost on me as I heard this. They were telling this story with Abdullah the Butcher sitting across the table. Abdullah the Butcher, who spilled more blood with a fork in a wrestling ring than anybody in the history of the business. So they set up a feud with Bad News Allen and the Stomper. And they were going to turn the Stomper babyface by having Bad News beat up his son. And it wasn't really his son. It was another wrestler. They just claimed that it was his son. Allen asks if he could use the fork in the angle. And they told him, I don't know if it was Bret or Bruce or somebody said no. In no uncertain terms, no fork. The commission is just watching for any little misstep to just pounce. No fork. So Bad News ignored them. And he used the fork anyway. And then as he was leaving, he attacked a 90-year-old fan in the crowd who reached out and hit him in the leg. Allen reached down, he picked him up by the hair or whatever hair he had left on his head. But they said, the guy legitimately had to be 90 years old, and he was a very big fan. He was always at the shows, and Allen assaulted him. So Allen's behavior is what led to Ed Whalen, who had been the host of the show. He was the voice of Stampede Wrestling. You think of the Attitude Era. Jim Ross, right? The voice of those Attitude Era shows. That's what Ed Whalen was for Stampede Wrestling back then. And he had been the voice of the promotion since the early 60s. But it's what led to him quitting the promotion. He felt it was getting way too bloody, way too violent. It wasn't, good family entertainment anymore. So it was a very big deal when he retired on the air. It was a very impromptu announcement that he made. Archie, the Stomper, and some of the other wrestlers had tried to talk him out of it, but he went on camera and he retired. And a lot of people thought that it was an angle, but it wasn't. It was a legitimate retirement. If you go ahead and search Ed Whalen on YouTube, Whalen, you'll see what a character this guy was. A whole bunch of interviews and clips with Ed Whalen from Stampede. You'll see what a character he was. But there was another incident with Bad News where he almost caused a riot, and he swung a chair at a fan that hit him on the leg, and it cost Stu his license to promote in Edmonton for about 6 months. So Bret said that he killed 2 towns for them in 2 days, and they never recovered from that. I don't think they were allowed to run Edmonton or Calgary for a while. And Stu started running shows on an Indian reservation just outside the city, and they were just bleeding money. So that happened in December of '83, the incident with Bad News. Stu sold the business to Vince McMahon in August of '84. Bret said that Vince never paid Stu a dime like he was supposed to. So Stu ended up getting the territory back eventually, about a year later, but the damage was done. So that's the story that Bret tells. Now, what happened is this. Vince McMahon was going around, he was making lowball offers to a lot of the promoters and a lot of the territories, and he was offering to buy them out. And basically his offer was, either you sell to me, or I'm going to promote against you, and I'm going to kill you off. So with Calgary, Stu sold the promotion to Vince, and Vince also, in buying it, got their television slot. So the idea was that Vince would also give jobs to Bret and Jim Neidhart and the Bulldogs, which he did. They kind of came as part of the deal. The deal was said to be for $1 million, although Bret has claimed it was $750,000, but it was $1 million, supposedly, to be paid in annual installments of $100,000. After that first year, Vince never paid the second installment. He claimed that they breached the deal because Bruce had started promoting these independent, mud shows in Calgary under the Stampede name, which was not allowed as part of the deal that Vince made with Stu. So that was Vince's way of reneging and not paying him the money that he was owed. But he let Stu reopen Stampede eventually. It didn't matter to Vince because he still had the TV slots. Those TV slots are what were most valuable to him. He didn't care about... The Stampede name had no value to him. But as long as he had those television slots, then he had what he needed. And Bret maintains to this day that Vince McMahon, he never paid his father a dime of what he was owed. And Stu never made a big fuss about it because he didn't want it to harm his son's career. He didn't want it to blow back on Bret. Or Owen later on. But the way Bret tells the story, he didn't... Again, this is not the story he told here on the show, but the way that he has told the story before is that Vince forgot. Yeah, he quote-unquote, he forgot to pay his dad. Yeah, he forgot. If there's one thing that Vince McMahon did not do back then, when he was going around to all these different promoters, it's forget. Vince McMahon did not forget, especially if somebody mouthed off to him or rejected his offer. I assure you, Vince McMahon did not forget. But Bret didn't know about any of this until Owen passed away. Until Owen died, he just assumed that his father got paid. Only after Owen died did he find out that his dad actually was never paid on that deal. Bret ended the episode with a great burn. He was talking about all the guys who got their start in Calgary and became huge stars, himself obviously. He mentioned Dr. D, he looked over at Abdullah across the table and mentioned him, and then he looked over at Bobby Bass and he said, "And Bobby, well, you did the best you could." I love it. I love it. The dry wit and humor of the Hitman, who, the more I listen to him, it's scary how much he sounds like Stu. It is very noticeable now.